Welcome to video lecture 10. I haven't spent 2 months in the British Isles watching the Great British Baking Show for nothing, because I can start off today's lecture by comparing a trifle, which is a pretty cool British dessert, to the kind of motet that we might find, around 1250 in our period in the Middle Ages. And I've brought this trifle out for a very clear reason, as I hope to demonstrate to you momentarily. In the French regions, in the mid-13th centuries, like I say, around 1250, there was an attempt made for a rhythmic notation. If you recall, everything we've looked at so far has been neumes that show us pitch and maybe suggest duration, but don't require any particular rhythm. That's why we can each perform a chant written in neumes with different lengths of notes, and nobody could say for sure that we're really wrong, to be different one to another. So there is this attempt to impose rhythm on the neumes of chant and the bits of organum and things like that. And the idea is to show, if you think about it, what is rhythm? It shows us proportions. What is long? What is short? When do we start? When do we stop? Yeah, but what notes are longer and how much longer? So this attempt to show the proportions and patterns of long and short is called mensuration. Mensural notation, measuring stuff, measuring duration. That's what we're talking about here. To us in the 21st century, this seems obvious because how much time do we spend thinking about rhythm? It's all about rhythm when you take an audition. I've got rhythm, the song goes. But here in 1250, people sang with durations and things, but there wasn't a way to notate it down. If you learned a rhythm, you probably learned it from somebody else who just did it that way or passed it along. So essentially they took the note shapes that had been used as neumes for pitch, and they said, well, let's let these note shapes also mean duration. So you'd actually need two sets of shapes. You'd need pitch neumes, and you'd need a second sort of rhythm printing or writing on the page that used the same note shapes, but now it meant hold this note for this long compared to that other note. This allowed the clever and elite composers of works such as the double motet in your book on page, I can't see it, page 82. It's also in your anthology 1/21. It's a double motet on the chant bit ex semine. So if you could write this little double motet, double because there's not only one part above the chant, but there's another part, so there's 3 parts total. They could take this sort of piece, and they could even take the idea of secular song as sung by, say, a troubadour, that is someone singing a love song. So they could, not a church song, they could produce a rather curious blended work that was both sacred and secular. They would start with the bottom, the tenor. In this case, a layer of cake. Start with the bottom, and these notes are moving relatively slowly. These are actually the original chant notes. Here they are, ex semineus, whatever they are in the original chant. That's what these notes are. And those few notes move relatively slowly with this new mensural notation. Now we could say, well, I can now tell you that some other notes are going to move faster. For example, I have some chocolate pudding notes that are going to move faster. And so it's a distinctly different layer. I hope you can see that. That was the whole point of this demonstration, wasn't it? There. Second layer. Pretty amazing. These notes are a poem written on the occasion of the chant that we're listening to, written to reflect more on the sacred chant that is the bottom of the piece. This is a sacred poem, and its rhythm is moving slightly faster. Then, for the top and perhaps most active, potentially most active layer, it's going to be independent from this chocolate layer or this cake layer. It's going to have its own rhythms. This is a big deal when you think back to the strict organum where everything moved together. This layer can do whatever it wants, and so I add this lovely layer, oopsies, of berries. Now with chant, unlike this trifle, I don't have to put it in the fridge for a couple hours. But with chant, unlike trifle, I can't top it with whipped cream either. So, arriving in the 14th century, the 1300s, the Trecento, the limits of this layering led not only to a search for a diet, but it led to the search for ways to not only allow more flexibility between parts, that all the parts didn't have to do the same thing, and could have more rhythmic variety, as we think of rhythmic variety, but it also led to the search to capture in writing the things that people were already doing in their performing. It's so easy for us as classical musicians who rely exclusively on printed music, most of us rely exclusively on printed music to tell us what the music is. It's so easy for us to think that, printing is everything. If it's printed, that's the reality. That is a viewpoint that only comes about hundreds of years later, really. Instead, people are trying to find a rhythmic notation so that they can write down like, oh gosh, what is that guy doing? Here's an example that's not related to the time period. When I was in grad school, I took an ethnomusicology course and we had to do field work. And so I and a friend went to observe a congregation of Sudanese Christians. They were refugees from the Sudan, and they would use our church building that I was attending and singing in the choir. They would use that church building in the afternoons for their worship services. And so Anna and I were trying to transcribe the song of this worshiping congregation that we were listening to, and trying to notate it in our system of notation. And I remember being so frustrated that I thought, well, this rhythm is really, it looks convoluted on the page, but they're singing it so easily. The problem is that I'm trying to write it in Western art music notation, and it's not that. And I can write it that way, but it's very laborious, like, oh, there should be an easier way. So the notational system was not as compatible with the style of music that they were performing as a different notational system. And that's what's happening in the Trecento. People are trying to figure out a way to write down rhythmic durations and proportions that reflect what people are already doing. This was, as I say, a scholarly and intentional process. The sort of mathematician musicians of this time period, like Machaut and Duvitry, they're trying to do something cool and new, and they actually are mathematicians. They have a lot of learning. A couple people wrote treatises on this new music. The Ars Nova is a book by Philippe Duvitry. Philippe Duvitry, you need to write that name down. He lived from about 1291 to 1361. Another guy that wrote a book, Jehan Demure, wrote the Ars Novae Musicae, the art of new music. They see themselves as making new music. Plenty of people were like, oh, those young whippersnappers making new music, that's disgusting. They also were trying to be revolutionary. Were they actually revolutionary? Only partly. They maybe didn't have as big a bang as somebody like Guido, whose staved notation really kicked off a lot of things, but I think a pretty big impact. What did they do rhythmically to capture these events and to help us create new rhythmic events? They divided rhythmic events into 4 orders or hierarchies. The divine ordering of the universe. They're thinking like medieval thinkers. There is a hierarchy here if we can just capture it. These hierarchies are the ancestors to our ideas of metrical class, beats per measure, subdivision of the beat. It's not quite the same, but when you look at the example, I'm going to show you a couple time signature examples. When you look at the example in just a second, you can see that, this is like 9/8. This is like 3/4. This is like 2/4. So it's possible now to actually see a correlation. We've finally come to a point where we see something that maybe is similar to what we practice today. Okay, check this out. So the system that de Vitry and de Moor sort of codified or defined has to do starting with a time signature, what we would call a time signature. It's the top of the hierarchy. So you need to say that you have a perfect time signature. Stay. Okay, if you see a circle with a dot in it, that is a perfect time signature. What that means is you have a brev that lasts the whole length of the measure, and that's divided into 3, I'm just making up my own symbols here, 3 beats, 3 semi-brevs. What? Half of a brev? Well, not half, part of. And each of these brevs can then be, the semi-brevs can be divided into 3 smaller subdivisions. So if what this means is 3 in every measure, I'm going to have 3 things, and each of those things has 3 subdivisions. That should look a lot like 9/8 to us. Oh, but it's cooler. Let's take away the dot. Now, it's not perfect. It's, you guessed it, imperfect. It's that easy. So now we say, well, hey, a note value that lasts a whole measure, still a brev, now still has 3 beats in its unit. But hey, each of those beats can be split into 2 pieces. So I have in every grouping or every measure 1, 2, 3. They're each subdivided one and 2 and 3 and. We've just notated the difference between this simple meter, like 3/4, and if I put the dot back, a compound meter. Don't go anywhere, dot. Like 9/8, 1 lale, 2 lale, 3 lale. You say, well, that's fine, but what if you don't want 3 beats in a measure? I mean, is it possible to not have 3 beats? I mean, I know, like, okay, great, holy number, Trinity, great stuff, but how is it possible to not have 3 beats in a measure? Well, you need to make the meter itself imperfect, not just the subdivisions. And here's how you do it. You break the circle. You want to leave the dot there, because that tells us about subdivision. And so now the length of a measure is split into 2 chunks. I'm just making up these symbols. Each chunk with this dot here, that's what tells me about subdivision, is grouped into groups of 3. So in this, the third order of time signatures, I'm going to have 2 big beats, 1, 2, but their subdivisions, 1 lale, 2 lale. In our modern notation, we would write it like this, and we'd be talking about 6/8. A duple compound time signature. Duple compound. Whoa. Okay, hang on. Goodbye, dot. Here's the 4th kind. I have this very interesting broken imperfect circle, which means that each measure is split into 2 beats, and there's no dot here in the middle to show compoundness. So each subdivision is broken into 2 pieces. Ha! So if I had 1, 2, one and 2 and. Whoa, that's 2/4 time. This C should look a little bit like our friends in modern notation. Common time, you say, well, that's a C for common time. But look where it originally came from in the Middle Ages, a broken circle. So that instead of writing it as 2/4 time, I could have a duple simple meter. There it is. 1, 2. 1 and 2 and. Whoa. Time signatures. All the way back to the Middle Ages. Rock on. Okay. So groups of 3 are perfect, following from the old poetic meters. 1 lay, 2 lay. And then we had imperfect stuff. So this kind of metrical hierarchy gives us all the possibilities of notated Western art music that we know up until the middle of the 20th century. So all of our common practice art music, now we can write it down. Wow, that's pretty cool. Do you remember the proportions of Solomon's Temple 369, which were shown in the Gothic cathedrals? This proportioning of triple meters, the most perfect metrical thing you could have would be 9/8. 3 big beats with 3 subdivisions. And how lovely if you went to super subdivisions if those were all triplets too. So that idea of the beauty of proportion, which we saw in architecture of cathedrals and we see in motets, now we see it infusing the rhythmic layer as well. A couple of examples. For example, on page 99 of your book in the anthology 1-24, De Vitri's Triplum, which ends with the word merito. It's got, I can't read my notes, something quoniam merito. I should write my notes better. So just give a look at that for a second. I'll update the title on the screen. What are the style characteristics of this Ars Nova motet, this really important motet? First, each part has a wide independence of rhythm. There is a hierarchy of beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That actually suggests modern bar lines. Bar lines are not used yet. That's what the time signature actually tells you to do. It says, hey, here's your circle with the dot. That means you, the performer, are gonna, in your head, every time you see a brev, you're gonna, or semi-brev, you're gonna go 1, 2, 3, and then start over, 1, 2, 3. That's how you know how you're gonna group them. Not because of some bar line saying, oh, you got to the end of the bar, but because you, the performer, are actually counting them as you perform. It's crazy, I know. What? Second style characteristic. A traditional slow tenor. If you look at the bottom line, the line that's texted merito, that's from the original chant. That's the text. And so that's an incredibly slow moving tenor. This third style characteristic also deals with the relationship of the three voices. Third style characteristic, 3 different texts, all happening at the same time. The bottom, slow, merito. The middle text is in Latin. It's a sacred text. It's not from the Bible, but it's a sacred poem. It's enlightening, explaining, elucidating the moment of chanted text. Here, it's like a little sidebar on it. A little Twitter. It's a tweet about the long text that is being chanted. And then the top text, the third one, is in French. And it's not sacred, actually, at all. The top text can be a secular poem. Could be about love. We have this really weird, and suddenly we're bringing in the vernacular into the sacred Latin Mass. This is weird. No wonder people were upset with this Ars Nova, this new art. That's crazy. It's also kind of confusing to listen to because you're hearing 3 different texts at the same time. But on the other hand, if you look at a cathedral, you're looking at supports and arches and decoration and ceilings. You're looking at lots of things, and you don't necessarily say, I can't deal with it. I can't take it in. Now, actually, the first time or a couple you look at the Gothic cathedral, that's exactly how I feel. I can't take it in. What's supporting the weight? What's decoration? That's a little bit like listening to these Ars Nova, these Trecento motets. One more element of organization that now also filters in to this style and is going to stick with us for a couple hundred years. It's not to do with this 3 different text thing, but it is actually used within the scope of the piece. Do you remember more about cathedrals? Do you remember the moment when they showed you that the cathedral footprint is in the shape of a cross? That the nave is this long bit, and then there's side chapels, transepts that make the side parts of a cross. You might have also thought from the video that the footprint of the one cathedral they were working in looked like an outline of a ship, the footprint of a big wooden boat, and that's true too. That's why the center of a cathedral or church is called the nave, N-A-V-E. The boat, navis, is the Latin word, boat. It's the boat of all the faithful souls, the ship of the church. So we have this great, huge floor plan. It's shaped like a cross, or it's shaped like a ship. Inside the cathedral, do you notice it? Not unless you know you're supposed to look for it. We can architect, we can create an architecture for a motet in a similar sort of large scale and almost invisible way, and that's called isorhythm. Isorhythm. That's a modern word that scholars of the 21st century used looking back at these 14th century motets. An isorhythm says, hey, you're going to take the tenor voice and you're going to let it move a little faster now, but not as fast as the upper 2 voices. You're going to give it, in fact, a rhythmic pattern. Let's say beat, beat, long, beat, 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 long, and that's your pattern. Beat, beat, long, beat, 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 long, whatever I said. Every time the tenor enters with some more notes, it's going to repeat that proportion of rhythm. Now, if you were really clever, you could take that proportion and you could do it at a faster level. 1, ba, 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 in an upper voice moving at a quicker level. So the rhythmic pattern, called the talia, that's a good vocabulary word. It's the rhythmic pattern repeated in an isorhythmic motet. The talia could be repeated at the slow foundation level, or quicker at a middle level. You say, hey, if you could repeat a rhythmic pattern, what's stopping you from repeating a pitched pattern? Do, re, mi, do, do, te, do. I just made one up. Okay, I'm going to use do, re, mi, do, do, te, do. Now you say, well, maybe it's the same length as that rhythmic pattern. Do, re, mi, do, do, te. Oh, I see, do, do, te, do is what I went. Do, re, mi, that's the long do, do, te, do. But as a matter of fact, they didn't care if those two things lined up. The pitch pattern, so I would hear throughout the piece, do, re, mi, do, do, te, do, as a little pitch motive. But maybe it would start halfway through my rhythmic pattern. Do on the long, re, mi, do, do, te, do. They don't have to line up, but they are there, weaving their way through this isorhythmic motet. This implies a huge background structure, an abstract structure that is unlikely to have been improvised. This takes planning. It takes people being able to write down a part and then look at it and say, okay, I'm going to write the triplum against it. I'm going to write the duplum. It's going to go this fast. They are still, by the way, not composing in full score. They are writing out one part, looking at it and doing it in their head. I think my other part's going to have to go this way. Pretty cool. You try writing counterpoint by not writing out both parts at the same time. That's what they're doing. So there's this huge isorhythmic background structure, both a rhythmic pattern that is chosen by the composer and a pitch pattern that is chosen by the composer. Often the pitch pattern is the actual pitch of the chant under which we are operating, under which this motet is based. Dictimi Pascal in laudes. So I could take my color, my pitch pattern, that's the other word you need to know, color, looks like color. Color, say it in an artful way. I could take do, te, do, me, fa, me, re, do. And that would be my pitch pattern that would repeat perhaps in the tenor part, the bottom part, or the middle or the top, at whatever speed or rhythm. It doesn't have to have the same rhythm. So, this architecture of the isorhythmic motet is not only emphasizing this incredibly ordered, structured universe that the medievalists saw. Everything has its place. The big stuff, the little stuff. This isorhythmic motet underlines that concept. But it also, you are bombarded with the talia at a slow level, at a fast level, the color at a slow level, at a fast level. The whole piece is bound together and it's like cascades of talia, color, sort of sprinkled over you and over you. It's meant to persuade, like a rhetorical argument. Like, I'm just going to keep shouting my point of view at you in every possible way, my rhythmic point of view and my pitch point of view in every possible way, to persuade you at every level. I guess that kind of sounds like the composer is shouting at the listener. I'm not sure it was a shout. It's meant to be sort of, I immerse you in this universe of this particular talia and this particular color for this motet. So, thanks Dimitri and Demers. We're going to see how this plays out in the works of really a sort of genius composer of this period named Guillaume Machaut, and I'll show you that another time.